There are certain moments in automotive history that feel almost impossible when you first learn about them. In 1976, at the absolute tail end of the muscle car era, with fuel economy suddenly mattering more than quarter-mile times, and with emissions regulations choking the life out of every V8 in Detroit, one car did something that nobody saw coming. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme became the best-selling car in America. Not the best-selling midsize car, not the best-selling Oldsmobile, the best-selling car in the entire country. It outsold every Ford, every Chevrolet, every Plymouth, every single competitor on the market. And the story of how Oldsmobile pulled that off is one of the most fascinating chapters in American automotive history. But before we get into it, drop a comment with the classic car you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next video. Alright, let's talk about why 1976 was the year Oldsmobile absolutely nailed it. To understand what made the 1976 Cutlass Supreme such a watershed moment, you have to back up and look at what Oldsmobile had been building toward throughout the early 1970s. The Cutlass nameplate itself had been around since 1961, originally introduced as a compact performance-oriented entry on the GM's new Y-body platform. Over the years, it evolved steadily, migrating to the A-body platform and growing in both size and ambition with each passing generation. By the early 1970s, the Cutlass had transformed into something completely different from its origins. It was no longer just a compact sporty car. It had become an entry point into a new kind of American motoring that blended the wide stance and presence of the classic American automobile with a level of interior refinement and personal style that buyers had never really encountered at this particular price point before. The Cutlass had also carried genuine performance credentials through the muscle car era. In the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, the Cutlass had been available with the 442 package, one of the most respected performance packages in the General Motors lineup. The 442 designation stood for 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, and dual exhausts, and the cars that wore that badge were legitimately quick in a straight line and surprisingly composed in the corners for their era. The brand equity that the 442 built for the Cutlass nameplate among performance-minded buyers was real, and when the muscle car era faded and those same buyers moved on to the next stage of their lives, careers, families, mortgages, many of them did not abandon the Cutlass. They simply followed the nameplate as it evolved into something that fit their new priorities. The redesign that arrived for 1973 was the turning point. General Motors had completely reimagined their mid-size A-body lineup for that year, and the Cutlass received what the industry would come to call the colonnade body style. The colonnade design was a sweeping formal roofline with a thick C-pillar, large opera windows, and a hardtop appearance that was actually structurally different from the true pillarless hardtops of the 1960s. Federal rollover regulations were beginning to move in a stricter direction in Washington, and General Motors had responded by creating a body structure that retained the open, airy hardtop look while incorporating additional structural reinforcement into the roofline. The result was one of the most elegant-looking mid-size cars that the American market had ever produced. Long hood, short rear deck, a roofline that swept gracefully down to a formal rear end with vertical taillights. The Colonnade Cutlass Supreme looked expensive in a way that its price tag simply did not reflect, and the American buying public noticed immediately. Sales of the Cutlass lineup climbed steadily from the moment the Colonnade body arrived. Buyers who had been priced out of the Cadillac DeVille and Buick Riviera saw in the Cutlass Supreme an affordable way to project the same image of success and refined taste. Young professionals who were just finding their footing in the workforce gravitated toward it without hesitation. Families who wanted something with a little more class than the standard station wagon or sedan found it completely irresistible. The Cutlass Supreme was threading a needle that very few cars in American history have managed to thread, being all things to all people while somehow never losing the integrity of what made it special in the first place. By 1974 and 1975, the Cutlass Supreme was already among the most popular cars in America, but there were still rough edges that the team at Oldsmobile was working to smooth out. Going into the 1976 model year, General Motors gave the Cutlass Supreme a careful round of refinements rather than a wholesale redesign, and those refinements were absolutely the right call. The exterior received subtle updates that modernized the colonnade look without abandoning the proven recipe that had made the previous car so successful. A revised front-end treatment with a more refined split grille gave the 1976 Cutlass Supreme a face that felt both fresher and more assertive than its predecessors. The chrome work was more thoughtfully applied, the body lines were slightly crisper, and the whole package came together with a maturity that the earlier Colonnade cars had been working toward. The roofline remained that gorgeous sweeping Colonnade roofline, and the opera windows stayed, because frankly, removing them would have been a design decision that nobody in the market was asking for. Those opera windows, with their formal dark glass set into the thick C-pillar, had become one of the defining visual signatures of the personal luxury coupe segment as a whole. They said something about the character of the car and the taste of its owner that no amount of chrome or badging could replicate. The overall silhouette of the 1976 car had a flow to it that was genuinely difficult to improve upon. On the inside, the 1976 Cutlass Supreme was the most impressively appointed version of the car that Oldsmobile had ever offered at that point in the nameplate's history. Deep cut pile carpeting covered the floors, the instrument panel had a clean, organized layout with a full complement of gauges that actually kept the driver informed about what the car was doing. Wood grain accents ran across the dashboard and door panels, giving the cabin a warmth and depth that the more Spartan interiors of competing makes simply could not match. Bucket seats were available with a center console for the buyers who wanted a more personal, sporting feel, while a full bench seat was available for those who preferred the classic American cruiser experience. The seat cushions were generously padded and supportive in a way that made long highway journeys comfortable rather than fatiguing. And if you stepped up to the Cutlass Supreme Brougham, the experience moved into a different category entirely. The Brougham Coupe in particular, with its slightly more formal roofline treatment and its richer standard equipment list, was the version of the car that directly challenged what the full-size luxury brands were offering. And for many buyers, it made the case convincingly. Now, let's talk about what was actually under the hood, because the 1976 Cutlass Supreme had a more interesting powertrain story than most people give it credit for. The base engine for the model year was the 260 cubic inch Oldsmobile V8, a small displacement unit by the standards of its era that made approximately 110 net horsepower. Before you immediately tune out on those numbers, understand the context. The entire American industry had been recalibrating its engines throughout the mid-70s, switching from the optimistic gross horsepower ratings of the muscle car era to the more honest net horsepower measurement system, and simultaneously wrestling with emissions controls that had cut deeply into the power output of every engine across every brand. In this environment, 110 horsepower from a base V8 was not an embarrassment, it was the honest reality of the era. And the 260's genuine saving grace was that it delivered notably better fuel efficiency than any larger V8 in the lineup, which, in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, was a quality that genuinely mattered to a broad segment of the buying public. But the 260 was only the beginning of the engine story. The 355 cubic inch Oldsmobile Rocket was the engine that the majority of Cutlass Supreme buyers gravitated toward, and with very good reason. The 355 Rocket in its 1976 specification made a healthy 170 net horsepower, and more importantly for everyday driving, it had a broad, accessible torque curve that made the car feel effortlessly powerful under a wide range of conditions. You did not need to wind the engine out to feel its strength. The torque was there from almost the moment you pressed the throttle, which gave the car a kind of rolling confidence that fit perfectly with its personal luxury character. The 355 was smooth, it was quiet, and it had a well-earned reputation for exceptional long-term durability. Oldsmobile's history of building engines that would go 200,000 miles without complaint was not accidental, and the 355 Rocket was perhaps the finest expression of that engineering philosophy at work in the 1976 lineup. And then there was the 455. The 455 cubic inch V8 had been the performance crown jewel of Oldsmobile's engine lineup going back to the early 1970s, having powered the most potent versions of the 442, the Toronado, and the full-size 98 through the peak muscle car years. In 1976, it was still available as an option on the Cutlass Supreme, and its presence on the order sheet meant something significant. It meant that Oldsmobile had not completely abandoned its performance roots, even as the entire industry was retreating from the horsepower wars. By this point, the 455 was a considerably more restrained piece of machinery than it had been in its absolute peak form in 1976 specification, but the nature of a 455 cubic inch displacement engine is that even in a somewhat detuned state, it brings an enormous amount of torque to the conversation. In the relatively light colonnade body structure, the 455 gave the Cutlass Supreme a genuinely impressive feeling of effortless power and authority on the highway. There was nothing quite like pulling onto an interstate with that engine under the hood. It barely seemed to be working at all at cruising speed, turning at low revolutions with a deep, unhurried exhaust note that quietly reminded everyone in earshot just how much displacement was sitting behind that long hood. The W30 performance package remained available in 1976 for the buyers who wanted to extract the maximum performance available from their Cutlass Supreme. The W30 option applied specific engineering attention to the 455, including a revised camshaft profile and enhanced induction calibration that freed additional horsepower and gave the car a noticeably more assertive character under hard acceleration. These W30-equipped cars were among the most capable performance vehicles that Oldsmobile was selling to retail customers in 1976, and in an era when genuine factory performance hardware was becoming increasingly difficult to find anywhere in any American showroom, the fact that you could still tick a box on the Oldsmobile order form and receive a factory-tuned performance package said a great deal about the division's determination to keep at least a measure of its motorsport heritage alive and accessible. The chassis underneath the Colonnade Cutlass Supreme was the perimeter frame A-body platform shared across General Motors' mid-size lineup, but specifically tuned for each division's individual character. Oldsmobile's engineers had calibrated the suspension toward the comfort end of the handling spectrum without completely surrendering body control. The front suspension used an independent short and long arm arrangement with coil springs, while the rear used a 4-link live axle setup also with coil springs, a configuration that provided a notably smoother and more controlled ride than the leaf spring rear ends found in many competing vehicles of the period. The result was a car that absorbed road imperfections with a smooth, composed action that felt genuinely luxurious at highway speeds and in city driving alike. Front disc brakes were standard equipment on the Supreme, a meaningful and practical upgrade over the drum setups that had been common across this price segment just a few years earlier, and they provided stopping capability that matched the car's comfortable and capable highway character without requiring significant driver effort. Transmission options were equally well considered. The 3-speed turbo-hydromatic was the dominant choice for the majority of buyers, and it was a gearbox that had built a solid reputation across the entire General Motors vehicle lineup for being smooth in operation, reliable over long service intervals, and well-matched to the torquey characteristics of all available engine options. The combination of the turbo-hydromatic with the 355 rocket was the sweet spot of the entire Cutlass Supreme lineup for the model year. It was effortless, it was refined, and it was perfectly calibrated for the kind of relaxed, confident motoring that most Cutlass Supreme buyers were actually doing on a daily basis. Competing against the 1976 Cutlass Supreme was not an easy task for any of the other manufacturers. The personal luxury coupe segment had exploded in popularity following the individual successes of the Pontiac Grand Prix and the original Chevrolet Monte Carlo earlier in the decade, and by 1976, there was no shortage of genuinely serious competition across the board. Chevrolet was fielding the Monte Carlo, a car that shared significant portions of its engineering foundation with the Cutlass and offered similar packaging with a more distinctly Chevrolet personality and dealer network. Ford had recently introduced the Elite, a refined version of the Torino that was aimed squarely at the personal luxury buyer, and was preparing to reposition the Thunderbird as well. and Chrysler had launched the Cordoba just a year earlier, an aggressively marketed entry that had been putting its name directly in the minds of American luxury buyers with a memorable advertising presence. These were all genuinely capable products, and any one of them in isolation would have been considered a strong and competitive offering for its respective brand. But the Cutlass Supreme beat them all. The reason why comes down to something that is simultaneously simple and profound. Oldsmobile had gotten every element of the personal luxury formula right at the same time in the same car in the same model year. The styling was resolved and confident. The interior quality was exactly where the buyers in this segment expected it to be. The engine and drivetrain calibration struck the right balance between economy and satisfaction. The pricing hit a value equation that no competitor could meaningfully undercut without compromising on something that buyers noticed. And, critically, the image that the Cutlass Supreme carried in the marketplace was precisely right for the moment. Oldsmobile had always occupied a carefully defined position in the General Motors brand hierarchy, meaningfully above Chevrolet and Pontiac in perceived prestige, but more accessible and less austere than Buick, and considerably more attainable than Cadillac. That positioning gave the Cutlass Supreme a breadth of demographic appeal that its competitors simply could not replicate from their respective brand positions. If you were a Cadillac buyer who had seen your fortunes change in the aftermath of the oil crisis and needed to step down in size and price without stepping down in dignity, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was the only logical choice that did not feel like a compromise. If you were a young professional buying your first truly nice car, the Cutlass Supreme felt genuinely aspirational without being financially unattainable. If you were a family buyer who wanted something more distinctive than a plain sedan, but needed the practicality of a full back seat, the Cutlass Supreme's two-door coupe body was spacious enough and comfortable enough to serve that purpose beautifully. This was a car without a clearly defined ceiling on its target buyer. The numbers that resulted from this perfect confluence of factors were genuinely staggering. When the final sales tallies were compiled for the 1976 model year, the Cutlass, across all of its body styles and trim levels, had sold over 480,000 units in the United States alone. That figure was enough to make the Cutlass nameplate the best-selling nameplate in the entire American market, period. Not just the best-selling midsize car, not just the best-selling Oldsmobile, the best-selling car in the country, ahead of everything. It outsold the Ford F-Series, which had been one of the strongest performing nameplates in the American market for years. It outsold the Chevrolet Impala, which had long held a position as one of the country's favorite passenger cars. It outsold the Chevrolet Monte Carlo, its most direct stablemate and one of its strongest competitors. The scale of that achievement is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, but in 1976, it was an absolute seismic event within the American automotive industry. General Motors hadn't been expecting quite that level of demand, and neither had the competition. The wave of buyers that descended on Oldsmobile dealerships across the country throughout the 1976 model year stretched the division's production capacity right to its operational limits. Dealers in major metropolitan markets were reporting significant waiting lists for popular configurations. The Cutlass Supreme Broom Coupe, typically specified with a two-tone paint combination, the full Broom interior, the 350 rocket engine, and the turbo hydromatic, was the exact configuration buyers wanted most consistently, and getting one without a meaningful wait required either excellent timing or a very good relationship with your local Oldsmobile dealer. The division moved as quickly as it could to meet the demand, but the sheer scale of what buyers were asking for was something that no amount of preseason planning had fully anticipated. Part of what made the Cutlass Supreme's success in 1976 so complete was the way it had managed to absorb the hard lessons of the oil crisis and the broader economic turbulence of the mid-70s without becoming a diminished version of itself. So many American cars of the period had shrunk in spirit well before they eventually shrank in physical size. The response to tightening emissions regulations had turned a generation of V8 engines into reluctant, strained performers in many cases, engines that felt constrained and apologetic rather than willing and capable. But the Cutlass Supreme's team at Oldsmobile had threaded that needle with real skill. The 350 rocket felt like a willing partner rather than a frustrated engine that would rather be somewhere else entirely. The chassis tuning delivered a ride quality that made cross-country trips genuinely pleasant rather than merely tolerable. The interior matched the promise that the exterior styling made, surrounding occupants in an environment that justified every dollar of the sticker price. There was also the matter of the Hertz Olds, which deserves its own moment of recognition within the broader story of the 1976 Cutlass. The Hertz Performance Products and Oldsmobile's partnership had been producing special edition cars since 1968, a collaboration that had yielded some of the most exciting and most memorable Oldsmobiles of the late muscle car era. The 1976 Hertz Olds was finished in a striking black and gold color scheme that stopped people where they stood. Gold accent stripes ran the length of the car along the lower body and over the roofline. Hertz badging appeared at key points on the exterior. Under the hood, the 455 cubic inch V8 was present and accounted for, reminding anyone who looked that the performance heritage of the 442 had not been entirely forgotten. The Hertz dual-gate shifter, among the most recognizable and celebrated automatic transmission shifters that the American performance industry had ever produced, allowed the driver to operate the turbo-hydromatic in either full automatic or complete manual control, depending on mood and circumstance, giving these cars a level of driver engagement and involvement that the standard Cutlass Supreme did not offer. Fewer than 2,000 of these cars were built for the 1976 model year, which made them immediately desirable as collector pieces even at the time of their release. The Hertz Olds was the Cutlass Supreme with the volume all the way up, a tribute to a generation that had earned its place. What happened after 1976 is worth understanding to fully appreciate just how perfectly timed this car's peak moment actually was. General Motors had already been in the planning stages of a wholesale downsizing of their full-size and mid-size lineup, a project that would reshape the entire General Motors vehicle lineup over the following few years. The 1977 Cutlass that followed was a significantly smaller and lighter car than the Colonnade version it replaced. That downsized car was excellent in its own right. The engineering teams at General Motors did extraordinary work on those new platforms. But it was a fundamentally different automobile. The broad, sweeping presence of the Colonnade Supreme, the sheer visual authority of that long hood and that dramatic formal roofline, the sense of occasion that came with easing yourself into one of those wide front seats and looking out over that expansive hood, all of that was gone after 1976. The Colonnade Cutlass Supreme stood as the final mature expression of a generation of midsize American cars that were still built on a scale that felt genuinely substantial and unhurried. That context made the 1976 model the definitive statement of everything that generation of Cutlass had been working towards from the moment the Colonnade body was introduced 3 years earlier. Every calibration, every refinement, every lesson absorbed from the market feedback on the 1973, 74, and 75 cars were applied to the 1976 with the precision of a team that knew they had something exactly right and were determined not to waste the opportunity. The styling was at its most resolved and confident. The interior quality reached its highest point within this generation. The powertrain options were broad enough to give every kind of buyer a reason to sign on the dotted line. And the sales numbers confirmed in the most unambiguous possible terms that the American market saw exactly what Oldsmobile built and responded accordingly. So what do you think? Does the 1976 Cutlass Supreme deserve its place as the definitive expression of the personal luxury coupe era? Or do you think one of its competitors had a stronger case? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because we've got a lot more automotive history coming your way.